A very warm welcome to Vikas and Mr. Muzammil. We're just waiting for the rest of the speakers to join us, so please bear with us.
What is everyone on board? Then we can start.
Yes, sir. Everyone's here. We'll be starting in a minute. Okay, perfect. So we've got all the speakers here. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good afternoon. On behalf of Islamabad Policy Research Institute, I welcome you all to today's webinar titled 74 Years of Indian Republic and the State of Politics and Stability. We are delighted to have with us 4 distinguished speakers to speak on the various facets of the topic. The first speaker is Mr. Muzammil Ayub Thakur. He is president of World Kashmir Freedom Movement and also serves as director at the Justice Foundation, Kashmir Institute of International Affairs. Thank you for being with us, sir. Second up is Dr. Farah Naz. She is an assistant professor at the Department of Government and Public Policy, National University of Sciences and Technology, Islamabad. Her area of expertise is on extremism and radicalization leading to terrorism, especially in the digital age. The third speaker is Dr. Raja Kaisar Ahmed. He is registrar and assistant professor at the School of Politics and International Relations, Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. His research work focuses on security and foreign policy, democratization, federalism, and ethnicity. He has 3 books to his credit, including the most recently published, Pakistan Factor and the Competing Perspectives in India. The last speaker for today's webinar is Mr. Vikas Jan. He is a senior analyst at the G5 Internet Observatory. His research interests lie in fake news and disinformation with a particular focus on regional and international geopolitics. To commence the webinar, I will request Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, Acting President IPRI, for his welcome remarks. Over to you, sir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thanks, Umar. I welcome all the distinguished panelists on this webinar. And I'm sure with the quality of the cast, we will hear some very good discourse, and will be all quite educated by the end of the session on a topic which is of extreme relevance and importance to not only Pakistan, but the Indian Muslims, and in fact, all the regional countries. We in our neighborhood have a government that purportedly is a republic, and it has just celebrated its Republic Day on 26th of January with a lot of fanfare. But the actual fact is that the republic is degenerating into a Hindu Rashtra, which is dominated by the ideals of Golwalkar, Ajwar, and extremists like Mohan Bhagwat, which have made life very difficult for Christians, Sikhs, Dalits, and other minorities inside the republic. We all know that United Nations and other human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, Genocide Watch, and independent think tanks, they have continually warned us about a new kind of Rashtra-inspired Hindu nationalism being imposed upon India, and which is leading towards a genocide-like situation inside the Indian, polity. The Genocide Watch has clearly mentioned that the situation in India is its eighth stage of genocide, and it is one stage short of religious extermination, which is a very serious situation. And it has a sad analogy, analogy with the Rwandan situation. And Greg Stanton has very clearly mentioned that he had also warned about Rwandan situation to international community, which was not properly heeded, and that led towards 0.8 million casualties, including Tutsis and other Rwandans. The same situation is unfolding inside India. We know that Greg Stanton has given a statement in the US Congress, which has clearly mentioned that the portents are really bad, and the genocide is just a couple of steps away from the last stage, which is going to be quite catastrophic for all the minorities. So at one place where this situation is leading towards marginalization of minorities, it is also exerting a lot of pressures, and this Indian Union that was kept glued because of Nehruvian secularism is bursting at the seam and coming apart. So situation is bad for Kashmiris inside illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. It is equally bad for Christians, Dalits, and the Muslims. Laws like Citizen Amendment Act, National Register of Citizens, the continual and ceaseless attempts are being made to marginalize the minorities so that their cultural and their religious identity is completely erased, and a kind of a cultural apartheid and a cultural violence, in the languages of scholars like John Galtung, is being imposed upon the minorities. We know that the efforts of BJP and RSS combined to rebuild Central Delhi, to rewrite history in textbooks, social media, and official propaganda, and to brutally subordinate subaltern populations such as those of illegally occupied Kashmir, are all a part of manifestation of planned Hindutva, which is being put in motion by Modi government. A digital assault has also been, in the past experienced on all voices of conscience. Javed Naqvi, a very erudite scholar and journalist, he writes in Dawn about the continual attempts on using sophisticated apps and modern digital tools to harry the voices of conscience and those minority voices that dare raise voice against this implacable wave of Hindutva totalitarianism that has been let loose upon India. So at one stage, it looked like there would be some voices of sanity inside the Indian Union, but looks like that those voices have been completely smothered and dwarfed in the face of a very aggressive Hindu nationalism that has taken hold of the country. And it has gotten hold of not only the polity, but also the cultural landscape. And therein lies the danger for not only the minorities, but the Indian Union itself. We know the Maoist areas, we know the northeastern states, we know illegally occupied Kashmir, we know in Indian Punjab, the plight of the Sikh community. All those are being rapidly marginalized, and this contains the portents of a pushback by these marginalized communities, which would not redound to the benefit of either Indian Union or the regional peace. While this danger is quite clear and present, the international community needs to be properly sensitized of the coming genocide and the possibilities of a complete disintegration of a fake union in which the Indian polity was bound. So with these few words, I would leave the turf open for a very accomplished assemblage of speakers who I'm sure will enlighten us in a little more depth about several aspects of Hindu nationalism and its various manifestations that are threatening the regional as well as the internal unity of India. So over to you, Umar, to commence with the first speaker.
Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now commence with the working session of this webinar. Before I invite our first worthy speaker, I'd just like to just put it out there that each speaker will have 15 minutes. I'd really appreciate if you please, keep to that time period just so that we can have more time for discussions and the Q&A session. And I'd also like to remind the participants who've joined us virtually to please keep sending in your questions and identify yourself and the institution that you are associated with. And I'd appreciate if you please refrain from making long comments. With that said, I would now request the first esteemed speaker, Mr. Muzammil Ayub Thakur, to share his views on the topic. Over to you, Mr. Muzammil.
Thank you very much to everybody at IPRI. It's always a pleasure to be hosted by you. Knowing that we have time constraints, instead of theoretical or academic discussions, although that may be my forte, I'd like to critically analyze the question of India, if India has actually regressed. I put it to you, India has evolved into what it always wanted to be. When we talk about India's regression, I would point out their philosophy and ideology isn't new and hasn't manifested all of a sudden. You only need to look at Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir as an example, an ongoing example since 1947. And what's important to understand is that India's agenda doesn't vary from one political party to another. There's general consensus in India that Kashmir is their integral part. Various parties are open and transparent in their agenda, while the rest are wolves in sheep's clothing. In context of Kashmir, I'll give the example of BJP revoking Article 370 and 35A and bifurcating Jammu and Kashmir, turning it from a de facto occupation to a de jure occupation, breaking international laws and UN resolutions along the way. The Indian opposition, the Congress party, jumped on the bandwagon and emphasized that the BJP were only able to unilaterally absorb Kashmir into the Union of India because the Congress party had spent years slowly diluting Kashmir themselves. They were fighting to take credit for an illegal and undemocratic action. And when they're not fighting for credit, they certainly don't condemn actions that would benefit the Indian political agenda of either party. Since partition, Kashmir has always been India's laboratory, where they've experimented with various versions of oppression and subjugation, whilst continuing their illegal occupation. It's never mattered which political party was in power. The Indian state have always maintained a singular policy on Kashmir. But there's more to India's policy. Using Kashmir as a testing ground for more than 70 years, the Indian government finally exported its trials to mainland India in the shape of the CAA and NRC, as Janjwar Saab said. Now, although the CAA bill was passed in 2019, the principle itself predates the birth of India. And those principles manifested in Kashmir over 7 decades on an extreme scale, leading to war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and demographic change. Now, while mentioning demographic change, it's worth noting that a report was published only a few months after Articles 370 and 35A were abrogated, stating that India have already issued more than 3 million domicile certificates to non-Kashmiris so they may permanently reside in Kashmir. The demographic change, ethnic cleansing, and settler colonial project is in full swing, so much so that it took Israel 50 years to do what India did in less than a few months. This is serious, because the only way to actually solve the Kashmir dispute, as we all know, is according to the UN resolutions. But now the precondition to that is not just the end, but the reversal of India's settler colonial project, forcing demographic change. Otherwise, the makeup of voters in a plebiscite will be entirely of colonists. Sooner rather than later, Kashmiris that have been fighting on the front lines, fighting for their right to self-determination, fighting for Ilhaq-e-Pakistan, will have our masjids converted to mandirs, our natural Urdu and Kashmiri language replaced with Hindi and Sanskrit. The truth is, we've already determined our future. It now rests on implementing our decision. The longer it takes, the more opportunities for our enemies to use subterfuge to obfuscate, manipulate, and disseminate propaganda with the intent to replace the truth with their own fabrications. Which brings me to the current Bjp government, headed by Narendra Modi, backed by the RSS, a parent organization of the Bjp, a radical, neo-colonial, right-wing fascist group that have an imperial expansionist program and aspire to create a pan-Hindu nation under one party as they believe they are a superior race and want to impose cultural nationalism. If that sounds familiar, that's because it is. Not just familiar, but identical to the ideals of Nazi Germany. Identical to the extent that the RSS's literature is inspired by Hitler and Nazism and even pays homage to them. RSS uniform is inspired by them. The RSS salute is inspired by them. And the RSS vision too is inspired by them. One party, one culture, one nation. The expansionist vision called Akhand Bharat goes as far as the Middle East, to the extent they claim the holy Kaaba in Mecca as their temple, referring to it as Makeshwar Mahadev temple. Now, what do you expect from people that call the Taj Mahal as Tejo Mahalaya temple, Qutub Minar as Vishnu Stamb temple, and of course the controversial now demolished Babri Masjid as Ram Mandir? Now, on a side note, I want to mention the foundation laying of Ram Mandir happened on the 5th of August 2020, exactly a year after India illegally annexed occupied Jammu and Kashmir. The symbolism is apparent and was purposefully done. There is no coincidence. First, they abolished the Kashmiri identity, and then they laid the foundations of the Hindu identity over the ashes of the Muslim identity by destroying the masjid. And it's not just the identity of those they consider lesser mortals that they want to diminish, but eliminate anybody that does not bow down to them, submit, or convert. We've seen numerous mob lynchings all over India, the threats of digging up dead Muslim women and raping them, concentration camps in Assam, and cold-blooded murder, obviously. And under the Bjp, the Indian judiciary has finally been given the freedom to be used as a tool to impose, institutionalize, and legalize the Bjp's reign of terror, Hindutva terror. For example, Afrazul, who was hacked to death, chopped to pieces by Shambhu Lal Regar while having it all live streamed on social media. What's worse is that he was later bailed by the Bjp to campaign for their re-election. In Kashmir, we've seen extreme forms of terror that can't even be described as human rights violations. And whatever has happened in Kashmir is not ancient history. It's all happened in our lifetimes and continues to happen right now. But what's worse is that no one in Kashmir has known anything less than occupation, subjugation, oppression, hundreds of thousands dead, destruction of property and businesses in the billions, tens of thousands raped, innumerable enforced disappearances, thousands of mass and unmarked graves, human shields, torture, bullets, pellets, orphans, widows, half-widows, cyber cells, media blackouts, illegal draconian laws, false flag operations, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, genocide, demographic change, settler colonialism, fake and staged encounters. The list is endless. Now, Kashmiri's frustrations were finally justified when the CAA and NRC bills were passed. We've been warning Indians for years what was to come their way, yet they watched what happened to Kashmiris and remained silent. The arguments that minorities in India had to be careful for their survival is a weak argument, if not a false argument. Because the people of Kashmir for more than 70 years stood firm in the face of oppression, subjugation, and occupation, despite the crushing forces of the Indian army and draconian measures of successive governments and little to no international coverage. Bear in mind, modern genocides and ethnic cleansings don't necessarily happen by bullets and tanks and missiles. Modern Indian fascism has paved the path to accomplishing the agenda of a pan-Hindutva nation, crossing the sovereign borders of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and into the Middle East. Now, although I said they've paved a path, they're not treading the path, not only walking the path, but their army is marching the path, waving the Hindutva flag. And the genocide in Kashmir isn't since 2019, not even since 1990. I would go so far as to say not even since 1947, the year of the Jammu genocide, where 250,000 Kashmiris were ethnically cleansed in a matter of days. I would argue that Kashmir has faced the longest genocide in modern history, if not in history. And it's not just India who performs these atrocities. It's the proxies they've created, along with the misinformation and disinformation campaigns they've launched for decades, more notably over the last year, targeting Kashmiri diaspora like myself and Asif Dar, constantly suffering from smear campaigns by India, which have led to serious consequences. And beyond misinformation is the celebration of those who exterminate Kashmiri Muslims. Only 3 days ago, the Jammu and Kashmir police received, and I quote, the highest number of gallantry medals. Out of 189, J&K police have been honored with 115 among all the organizations, which means traitors, or as we call them, collaborators, those within our own community who've sold their soul to the devil and become agents of India, have received the most and the highest honors for their participation in the eradication of Kashmir and Kashmiris. Kashmir police has been conferred with more awards than 7 of their sister organizations combined under the Indian Central Armed Police Force, which includes the BSF and CRPF. Let me also make it clear that the Central Armed Police Force's personnel also serve in various intelligence organizations such as RAW, IB, NIA, and CBI, to name a few. Interpret that as you will. What can you expect from a nation whose army chief laments that protesters use stones instead of guns, as it would then be easier to justify killing children? Or of the army major who screams on an Indian news channel to continue using rape as a weapon of war in Kashmir? Or of political leaders directing their supporters to dig up graves of Muslim women and rape them? Or of a terror accused being supported and winning a parliamentary seat? Circumstances in India as we see them now didn't suddenly transpire. They're progressively manufactured and nurtured. Modern radical Hindutva fascism and terror may have reached a critical point in 2019, but it has always been simmering beneath the surface, and there's 7 decades worth of examples to prove its growth. In the short time available, I'll barely be able to touch the surface. Over the last 7 decades, there's been a sustained campaign to demonize Kashmiris and convince the Indian public of the alleged threat that we pose to their national security. They justify their crimes and make it palatable by using anti-Kashmir, anti-Muslim, and anti-Pakistan narratives, which softens the public towards Hindutva fanaticism, convincing them of the necessity of their actions, essentially radicalizing the population. India's own media has extensively written about mass radicalization among Hindus that India itself doesn't acknowledge. Case in point would be 8-year-old Kashmiri Asifa, who was kidnapped, raped, and gang raped in 2018 by 8 Hindu extremists, and then killed. Mass protests followed, demanding the release of the criminals, if you can believe, who were eventually granted bail. This is the same country that awarded medals to those who staged 2 fake encounters in Pulwama and Srinagar last year, alleged that they were terrorists, only to be proven as lies days later. And when the families demanded the bodies, they were charged under the draconian UAPA law. And I'm sure we can't forget the tears of Dr. Mudassir Gul's daughter, narrating her father's murder a few months ago, along with Altaf Bhatt, and the Indian occupational forces laughing at her when she asked them why they killed him. Those same occupational forces staged a fake encounter that killed Zia Mustafa a few months ago, whose case has now been launched by Stoke White solicitors and Legal Forum for Kashmir. He accidentally crossed into Indian-occupied Kashmir from Azad Kashmir in 2003 as a 15-year-old boy, and then suffered 19 years in jail. His entire adult life, he spent more time behind bars than he did as a child. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Shahid Gilani Saab and Shahid Sehrai Saab. UAPAs were lodged against their families who weren't even allowed to perform the last rites of their elders, our leaders, and instead their bodies were desecrated. In conclusion, the fascism of Nazi Germany may have been defeated in 1945, but Hindutva fascism was founded in 1925 and today has flourished. 2019 wasn't the beginning of India's regression. The RSS was and is anti-Muslim, anti-Christian, and anti-left, and could have been dismissed as a lunatic group as long as they remained on the fringes of mainstream politics. But it's on the fringes that they've injected themselves into the arteries of India. Its political offshoot, the BJP, formed in 1980, had only 2 MPs in the Lok Sabha in 1984. But now the party rules the country. Make no mistake though, the opposition are no better than the current government. The only difference is that one is bold enough to declare an open assault while the other uses a velvet glove. It may have been the BJP in power when Abhinandan was shot down and had fantastic tea, but it was Congress during the 47 war, it was Congress during the 65 war, and it was Congress during the 71 war, let alone what they did in Kashmir. I think I may have crossed over time, so please forgive me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Muzammil, for a very comprehensive presentation and talking about the evolution of the Indian society. I will now request the second speaker, Dr. Farah Naz, to deliver her talk. Over to you, Dr. Farah.
Thank you, Umar. Thank you, Muzammil, for setting out such a beautiful and excellent layout for our discussion. So I really appreciate the way he mentioned that the masjids are going to be replaced with mandirs, but we need to see why it's going to happen. What is the ultimate agenda of the RSS and the Modi regime to replace masjids with mandirs, and what actually is happening on the ground? If we, of course, if we look at the Kashmir situation, Kashmiris are really in a very difficult days that they're going through and difficult situation that they are going through. But it is not only limited to the Kashmiri population and the Muslims, but all other religious minority groups also who are living there in India, who are going through immense pain and torture. And if we look at the divisions in India, religious divisions in India, there are Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Jains, Buddhists, and Zoroastrians. So each one of them are really going through immense pain and torture. And in my analysis, I always look at not only the minorities, but Hindus themselves who are becoming a target of the Modi's fascist agenda, which nobody is covering and touching upon. I think the RSS agenda is affecting the life of each one of them who is there, who are against the ideology of Hindutva. So for that, we have to look into, we at times confuse Hinduism with Hindutva. Hinduism, according to its basic definition, it is very tolerant towards each and every group who lives in India. And its agenda is all based on secularism. That's what Gandhi promoted. The 4 pillars of Gandhi, it suggested that there should be truth, self-rule, and progress for all, and it should be based on non-violence. So the Gandhi's agenda of how to establish a secular system in India, I think the current government have completely taken a 360 degrees turn from that, and that is the reason that there we can see a lot of confusion and instability in the political system of the India. At this stage, if you look at the political stability index, India is standing at 159. And I think that is quite the way they project themselves in terms of economic development, which the numbers are really questionable. But if we look at that, I think the ranking is quite lower in those terms, because the Indian diaspora is spread across the world and they are doing an amazing job. We cannot deny the facts. But why is still there a lot of political instability existing in India? I think that is because of their political ideology and agenda that the current government is running in India, that is leading towards lots of problems, not only for the minorities living there, but also Hindus who it's their first right, to enjoy all the perks and privileges as Indian citizens. So with the recent amendments in the constitutional arrangement, the anti-conversion law and the citizenship law, I think that is leading to several challenges for the Modi regime. And we could now clearly see the pushes and the pull forces that is reflecting plurality and diversity across India, which like India is known for, it is getting questioned these days, because India is home to a diverse group of people where several languages are spoken, where several communities have to live together. And the forefathers of India, they were promoting equality for all and tolerance for all, which the current governments have taken, the current government, particularly under Modi, have taken, a complete U-turn of all those perspectives and ideologies that were spelled out for the Indian leadership at that time. So it is leading towards, sort of a strong instability in the political system in India, and we could see that democracy is getting shaky in India. And if we say that India is still a democratic state, I always say no, India is a castocratic state, where caste system have strong, significant position in India rather than giving everyone its due share, where based on the citizenship law, where based on your religion, if you will be allowed to get citizenship, I think that is one of the major drawback that the current government have tried to introduce to the political system in the country, because it led towards raising several questions about the democratic system of the country. If really India is following a democratic system, or is it really based on some pick and choose criteria or template that they have to follow? So if we overall look at the entire situation, I think the Modi regime under the RSS and under the Hindutva ideology, they have to bring certain changes within their outlook. Otherwise, it will lead towards several challenges for the current government to run their system. And secularism, I would say, for a diverse sort of India, which is home to so many nationalities, not nationalities, but divisions according to their ideological understandings. So if they don't allow secularism in India, I think it will lead towards extreme intolerance. And I think we have seen it when at the time of 1947 and before that, when the Indians, they were getting intolerant towards Muslims at that time, which Muslims still happen to be the second largest minority in India. So when they were not giving Muslims their due share and things, of course, there were certain problems as well, which we cannot deny, that led towards partition of India and Pakistan. So it should not happen in the current situation, where still people are not happy with the existing setup, the political system in India. If it continues, it will lead towards breakage and divisions within India. That could be either very good for the people whose lives is getting affected, or it could be disaster for the India as as a strong country which represents so many minorities, so many representation of so many groups living there. With this, I think I will leave it here, and I would like to take more questions and comments from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farah, for your views. I will now request the third speaker of this session, Dr. Raja Kaisar Ahmed, for his remarks. Over to you, Dr. Raja Kaisar.
Well, thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible, but we can't see you.
Yeah, you won't be able to see me. Actually, I'm not feeling well for a couple of days and I'm in a quarantine. So since I have made a prior commitment to the IPRI, so I thought it would be very unprofessional at my part if I back off at the 11th hour. So I'll be continuing with my audio version of presentation.
Thank you so much for being with us, sir.
Yeah, please bear me out. Thanks for your esteemed invitation in the first place. And I also extend my profuse gratitude towards my earlier panelists who had been very articulate and have voiced some very important, rather very significant issues and frame of analysis. When we today are years of India as a republic, so then there are definitely more questions than answers as of today, because India's tryst with Indian nationalism, which was promulgated by Indian National Congress, was perhaps not something which was indigenous, because it was more inspired by the colonial ideals and those ideals of inclusivity, then coexistence, this communal interlinking, all of these things, they never had existed in practicality in India, because before that, India had a past of being ruled by invaders. So you see that India's republic, when it is founded in 1947, so all these colonial ideals, they had been there for the first 3 decades, but ever since the rise of Hindutva and this Hindu nationalism and this saffron tide, so we see that these colonial ideals are dwindling. So the real India, which they take inspiration and impetus from Sanatana Dharma, so which believes in the outright Hindu supremacy and which believes in the superiority that comes into its place. So when that comes into its place, we see its very vitriolic manifestation in the form of BJP, RSS, and we see its practical manifestation in the form of Hindutva juggernaut, which is ruling India in its second continuous term, Modi 1.0 and Modi 2.0. So you see that this is such an intolerant philosophy right now, such a proto-fascist regime which is there in New Delhi, which feeds on divisive rhetoric, which believes in incendiary narrative and which believes in changing and reshaping the contours of state and society in India. What Indians are doing to Muslims, what Indians are doing to Kashmiris, and what right now BJP and its co are doing to the minorities in India, they are reflective of a fact that India had made its transgression to its actuality. I that India never demonstrated its secular colonial ideals. They were mere there in theory. They haven't been put into practice, because if we look at the stints of the Indian National Congress being in power, Indian National Congress was no way different than BJP. Indira Gandhi was towards Kashmiris had never been different like of the Narendra Modi. So all these draconian laws, whether FSPA, whether POTA, whether it's TADA, so they haven't been all implemented under BJP. They have been taken into consideration and taken into implementation during the rules of Congress as well. So if we look today, as Arundhati Roy, she rightly puts it up, that in India we are simultaneously living up with 3 generations. One generation which is very handful of generation and living in the 21st century, whereas majority of the Indians, they are living still in the ideals of the 20th century with racial superiority and with this idea of martial race being into place, and this Hindus being as the supremacist nation, and Hindus nationalism as the supremacist ideology. So as Muzammil has rightly said, that it can be very equally put into juxtaposition with Nazism, so which also had that very underpinning of ethnobiological superiority. So while Indians, they claiming on the very same lines, and as the Prime Minister of Pakistan has repeatedly equated it with fascism and Nazism, it in itself speaks what India is being through. The Indian polity right now, and those the trajectory over which it has embarked upon, that is of Hindu nationalism, Hindu superiority, and making India a Hindu Rashtra. That is something which has very catastrophic impinging, not for the domestic politics of the India, but it also has its dividends for the regional peace and overall for the international relations of India. Because the way India is making a headway with its diplomatic and economic success in the world and in the global landscape, and the way India is getting ahead with its diplomatic triumphs at the global level, and the kind of ideology which they are promulgating, cultivating and insinuating at their domestic landscape, it does not go hand in hand. So that's why, you know, while what can be even more paradoxical right now, that Indian Muslims, they are claiming themselves to be Indians, and the Indian government is asking them to substantiate that if they are Indians. They are not ready to buy their claim that they are Indians. And on the other hand, the Kashmiri Muslims who refuse to be Indians, who refuse to accede to the identity of Indians, they are forcefully they are emphasizing an identity over them, and they are telling them that no, you are Indians. So this is a very strange situation. India is at the verge of an internal implosion. You see that what is happening to Sikhs over there. That is something which in itself speaks volume of the monstrosity of the situation which the state and society over there it is being through. The Nehruvian ideals of liberal democracy, composite culture, and Indian nationalism, they are dwindling, and they are being replaced by Hindu majoritarianism, Hindu nationalism, Hindutva, this Sanatana Dharma. All of these things, they are leading India to a very myopic and a very parochial polity. And this myopic and parochial polity, with its diplomatic and economic capital, is becoming even a bigger juggernaut. So that's why the international community, it cannot remain oblivious of what India is being through and what India is up for, because the kind of atrocities they are scourging Kashmiris with. And over Kashmir, you see that in India, whether it is their center, whether it is their right, whether it is their left, they all have the very similar opinion. And they believe in suppressing Kashmiris. They believe in suppressing the indigenous resistance of Kashmiris, and they believe in forcefully assimilating them into the Indian Federation. So that's why this thing right now, when we today are at the eve of commemorating, if not commemorating, then observing this 74 years of the Indian Republic. So Indian Republic poses a very bleak picture. The Indian state and society right now, I mean, this their civil society has become so overstretched that it does not voice out over the important issues. What is happening to people in Kashmir, what is happening to minorities within India, it remains unchecked. And above all, without any checkmate or by the international forces, by the international society, by the international community, this is further burgeoning the confidence of the Modi government, and they are further going more stringent on Muslims and on other minorities. So that's why this Nehruvian edifice of Indian nationalism, the Nehruvian state, which was the artifact, which was the embodiment of the Indian nationalism and composite nationalism, is at tatters. It is dwindling, and what is it is being replaced with is very dastardly, and it poses very climactic implications for the state and society in India, for the regional peace, and for the international peace at large. I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Raja Kesar. I will now request the last speaker of the webinar, Vikas Chand, for his presentation. Over to you, Vikas.
Thank you very much, Umar, and always a pleasure to be invited to IPRI. I'd like to just address something that Mr. Muzammil Saab said about how this isn't India's regression, or rather its evolution of what's happened to it, and how what we call basically India's slide towards illiberalism and just all-out autocracy is not something that has happened just all of a sudden. It's been happening over time. And I think Pakistan has been raising that issue for the last 75 years now. One just has to look at all our statements at the UNGA and see how often Pakistan has repeatedly used these and raised these same issues over and over again. All throughout its inception, right? I think the only time where you won't find such rhetoric was during the composite dialogue between 2004 and 2008. And then that glimmer of hope that we had for peace with India. But again, one just has to look at the first speech by Sushma Swaraj and how that rhetoric has changed and how India's slide towards extremism, totalitarianism, and whatnot has just manifested itself over and over. And of course, as Pakistanis, as a Pakistani institute, as a Pakistani platform, of course, this issue is going to be raised. Pakistan is the most affected by India from a security perspective, from a cultural perspective, from every perspective that stands. It held true 75 years ago, and it holds true even more today. But it's not just Pakistan that is seeing this. You have the Freedom House, the US-based Freedom House Institute dropping India from free to partly free. You have the Swedish Research Institute downgrading India from an electoral democracy to an electoral autocracy. And of course, the Economic Intelligence Unit's report last year, which claimed India as being a flawed democracy. You had US Senator Elizabeth Warren, 2019, raise concerns about Kashmiri rights, and you had Dem representatives Pramila Jayapal raise concerns about the fundamental principles of democracy, along with a bipartisan resolution sponsored with the Republican Rep Steve Watkins. So this is becoming evident, and it's not just Pakistan that is seeing this now, that has been affected by it. This is affecting the world. I think one of the most interesting pieces to have come out in recent times that addresses this is Dan Markey's article on how he discusses the US strategic implications of what this India slide towards illiberalism or a less or this removal of erosion of democracy would lead to US policy, how it would affect US policy in the future. And it's pretty bleak. It's just in it, I'm just going to borrow in just the framework he uses. He's identified basically three main areas which show how India has been changed, and what we are calling, and what our esteemed panelist speakers have tried to have articulated so clearly, how we can basically frame that in a sense that is data-driven, that is backed by, that is more easily acceptable and is more accessible to wider audiences, something that makes sense and resonates. So again, one of the basic things that you see first is India's tightening of media restrictions. One just has to look at how India's treating Rana Ayub, the Washington Post journalist, and the kind of threats and the smear campaign that's been going on for the last good 2-3 years against her work, against everything she stands for. Second being India's more repression of its civil society organizations, how over 20,000 NGOs have been shut by India between 2014 and 18. And this is, of course, since the Bjp government came to power. I don't know why this doesn't get discussed much or heard much, but Amnesty International's offices in India have been shut since 2018 or 19, I think. And again, it's something very scary to see that how once a government that was held as a paragon of a secular democracy for the world has faced that, especially when you compare the comments made by President Biden and Secretary Blinken, and especially those that were made during the recent Quad address, the joint web address, where you had the leaders from the Quad talk about how this is a platform for a free world, a more sustainable, a more democratic world. And last, obviously, which I'd like to focus more on is India's treatment of minorities. Now, a lot gets said about how India's caste system, India's inherent ethnic divisions, and how basically they have been wreaking havoc within the Indian Union. But I think it's always good to see how, in a visual form, how basically India's fault lines really do exist if we map them out. So I had the pleasure of actually trying to put together a few slides, which I hope are visible to all. Can everybody see them?
Yes, we can, Vikas.
Okay, thank you. So just to give you a basic trend, the raw numbers. By the way, these are all statistics reported by the National Crime Bureau of India. So these are statistics provided by the Indian government. And obviously, they're not the full picture, but they still present a very clear idea of what it is that's been happening in India. So if we just map out over the last decade and see how the number of incidents of communal violence have been reported in India, there is an upward trend starting from 2014. And this, of course, has been stratified across different regions. If we just look at the political map of India in 2019, which was obviously the peak of when we saw these communal violence, being the Delhi riots, the Citizen Amendment Bill, and of course, the repulsion of Article 370. So 2019 represented how the peak, BJP's peak in India. And the orange, of course, represents where the BJP has been in control. And if we compare that against those same data that we had from communal violence and map that in the same map, we can see where exactly which states saw the most amount of violence. So it's Gujarat. We have the Gujarat, Prime Minister Modi's home state. We have UP, which is where the CM Yogi Adityanath is still has led a vociferous campaign against against minority Muslims and Christians. We have Bihar and West Bengal, which have historically remained communal hotspots. And of course, Haryana and Punjab, where we have the Khalistan narrative and the Sikh farmers' protests were at peak. Moving on, if we apply the same towards 2020, when the COVID pandemic was in full swing, we saw a similar pattern in the same states. UP obviously being the main state where where communal violence has remained a problem. We have Haryana and Rajasthan because of the farmers' narrative, and obviously Assam as well, Bihar and Assam. Now, I know a lot of us focus on Kashmir, and since childhood we've been told we've had the Kashmir file every night at 9 p.m. But I think that kind of takes away exactly the underlying fault lines of how dangerous communalism within India actually is. It's not just Kashmir. Kashmir is a symptom of what India has been seeing and has been going through for over the last 2-3 decades. I mean, one just has to look at even the emergency, Operation Blue Star, when the Khalistan issue was actually at its peak, and you had Indira Gandhi launch the emergency. There was a massive shift in India in trying to curtail this idea of how these fault lines of India has remained divided and is divided. If we just take an example of culture, and for example, how the Indian film industry has presented that, you had movies like Amar Akbar Anthony come out right after the emergency, where you have the cast of a Muslim brother, an Indian brother, and a Christian brother living together. And then that was supposed to be the height of what Congress portrayed itself as a shining secular India. But fast forward 3-4 decades, and the kind of content you see coming out of the Indian film industry, the ones glorifying their mythic past, glorifying the Hindu Rashtra, showing how their treatment of how they're trying to reshape and rewrite history in terms of Mughal impact and leaders and how Muslim rulers were basically came as invaders and barbarians. It's pretty evident on where that narrative has shifted and where it's ended up. So if we use that, for example, the case of the Aryan Khan drug case, this is actually a very interesting way to map out how we saw those fault lines emerging right in a very interesting data case. Just a bit of background, this case occurred back in October 21, where you had Aryan Khan, the son of famous actor Shah Rukh Khan, get caught up in a drug case. And at the same time, there was this story going around of Ajay Mishra Teni. And this was basically the Lakhimpur incident, where the son of a major BJP bigwig ran over a group of protesters, protesting farmers, protesting on the road. So around the same time, what we saw was that obviously the BJP spin machine went into full swing trying to cover the Ajay Mishra story, and the Aryan Khan case got pushed as well. So this is basically a map of Google searches on each case. And we wanted to see basically which states saw the most interest in either case. And again, what we saw was the same fault lines that we saw on the earlier maps, the same existed within this. For example, states where the Ajay Mishra story was trending are basically states where the BJP has less of a, where the communal incidents have been on the rise. Obviously, these include Punjab, these include Rajasthan, these include Gujarat, and Kashmir as well. On the other hand, the Aryan Khan drug case was trending basically where the BJP strongholds. UP is a very interesting case because it was just slightly where the Aryan Khan case was basically edged out this case. But I think this case presents a very interesting way to see how these fault lines exist and how they're very real within an India that is basically imploding. The same way we've seen over time, if we apply the same kind of analysis over time, what we saw was that how rhetoric and how what's been defined as dog whistling, what BJP leaders have consistently done as part of their electoral campaigns has affected these patterns of communal violence. So what we did was basically looked at three main BJP leaders who are known to be very polarizing. Sambit Patra is the head of the BJP spokesperson. I think he's the lead spokesperson. Ram Madhav, the head of the RSS, and of course Yogi Adityanath, the CM of Uttar Pradesh. Now, what we wanted to see was how their rhetoric and basically what it is that what they say translates into communal violence. And what we saw was a very clear cyclical pattern based on elections. Right around election times, and yes, there are February 10 is when the next state elections are. We've seen a significant drop in communal violence. What that says is right around election time when you have these leaders campaigning, there's obviously a focus on unity, a focus on trying to talk about the state, the union, and promote a cohesive picture of India. But at the same time, the kind of dog whistling, the kind of polarization, and the kind of rhetoric that we see coming out is exactly aimed at stoking those tensions. The BJP has built its mark, it's built its brand on stoking communal tensions. So what we see is that it's only after elections, a month or 2 months right after elections, usually when they win or when there's been a result, that we see a huge spike in communal violence. The same was witnessed in 2019 during the summer, when after the elections in IOJK, there was a huge spike and all that rhetoric basically fueled into rising cases of incidents. The same holds true for the Citizen Amendment Chip Act, which the following year in the summer, we saw a massive spike in violence. And then of course, the COVID pandemic hit and we saw the rhetoric shifting towards the end. So in the end, I think the way we can, and the same can be expected now as well. Right now, communal incidents have relatively seen a decline as we come closer to the elections next February 10th. But the way it's been playing out doesn't hold well for the BJP. So I'm just going to wrap it up in terms of how, looking ahead, what we see happening now. Obviously, if you compare this map to what we saw in 2019, the BJP is on a decline. It has basically the costs of what it did and what it has been doing, it has had to basically pay that, and the effect is pretty clear. This is true, especially in the East, where you have the TMC, the Trinamool Congress under Mamata Banerjee, and the Samajwadi Party basically presenting a major challenge to their chances ahead. While the BJP is focused on the Indian National Congress, and the Congress itself is basically breaking apart into different factions and defecting to these other parties, I think what we're going to see ahead is a more polarized India, a more divided India, and one in which the BJP's near monopoly on rhetoric and on basically far-right extremism is likely to get even more dangerous. So with that, I would like to end my part, and I'm open to discuss questions from anyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Waqas. So we're done with the formal presentation, and we'll move on to the Q&A session. So the first question is for Dr. Raja Kaisar. It is from Fazan Fakhr, a researcher at Islamabad Policy Research Institute. Dr. Raja Kaisar, he asks, do you think the current wave of hyper-nationalism in India is mainly personality-driven, or is it more of a structural transition in the Indian democratic system? And I think by the personality-driven, he's referring to the Modi phenomena. Dr. Raja Kesa, can you hear me?
Yeah, please. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't follow.
No worries, sir. I'll repeat the question. So the question is that do you think the current wave of hyper-nationalism in India is mainly personality-driven, or is it more of a structural transition in the Indian democratic system?
Well, Hindutva is now a social and political reality in India. It's not just merely personality driven. It hasn't got to do with Modi only as one individual. Because if you see in the early first 3 decades of the independence, Congress, its idea of composite nationalism, it had been at the front. It had been at the forefront. It had been at the front burner. But when today you look at this BJP and its vociferous voice of Hindu nationalism, it is taking the lead, and it is sweeping across the regions. And if you see that the trends of BJP making headway in the state elections in India, even BJP had managed to sway electoral victories in those states where it never had presence even. It managed to vanquish the leftist party's rule in Tripura, which was there for last 3 decades. So BJP managed to win election over there. BJP managed to win election even in Northeast by making governments in Meghalaya and Mizoram. So even in Nagaland. So you see, when today we look at the broader matrix of Indian politics, we see that BJP and its idea of Hindu nationalism, it is expanding. It is massively expanding, and it is even sweeping across those areas and those polities where it was not existent previously. So BJP's ideology is there to stay. What can happen in the future might be, BJP, when there won't be a strong leadership, there might be a party from within BJP. So you see that Hindu nationalism, it is a robust phenomena. We'll have to accept its reality and we'll have to live with it because it is there to stay.
Okay, since you mentioned the elections, I'll just pose one more question to you, sir. So this is a question from Ms. Maheen Ahmed. She's a researcher at IPRI too. She asks, to what extent do you think the upcoming state assembly elections in India's Punjab will determine the future of the ruling BJP? Do you think it might bring about some sort of changes, or do you see the same? Dr. Raja Kesar, were you able to listen to the question? Okay, so if I could pose the same question to Mr. Muzammil, if you could please give your views on whether the upcoming state assembly elections in India's Punjab would determine the future of the ruling BJP.
Thank you. I think it's not going to be completely and utterly dependent on just Punjab in India. There are far too many anomalies and far too many other states that are involved as well. And also the way that the BJP have successfully built a particular narrative in regards to what they want to do with India, hyper-nationalism. Now, you see, they've blurred the lines between nationalism and patriotism. So anybody that questions the BJP is immediately neither a nationalist nor a patriot. The Congress party, or for that matter, the Aam Aadmi party, things that are happening in Punjab, I think are, I wouldn't say minuscule, but I would say that they may affect the BJP, but not on a scale where they may lose the elections. I personally think that the BJP are clever enough. They have enough people within their ranks. I mean, look, can we also remember that the BJP is not just the BJP? We also have people like Ajit Doval, who is the National Security Advisor. Although he may not be a member of the BJP formally, but he is a member of the RSS. He is the one that is giving guidance to the Prime Minister and the Home Ministry and the Foreign Office of what needs to be done. He's also the same person that performs or is responsible for actions inside Pakistan and beyond. So they know how to whip up votes. They are very clever at whipping up votes. This isn't the BJP or Vajpayee or who else was there? Not again, it evades me right now. But this isn't that BJP. This is the modern BJP. This is modern fanaticism, modern Hindutva, modern fascism. And I think they know how to whip up votes. I understand that the BJP, within their ranks, they've hired professionals. They hired, you only need to look as far as India, that how much money the government of India have spent in lobbying, have spent in marketing, have spent in public communications to change their image abroad. The fact that Islamophobia was rampant in the West, and I know this is, I know this is going to go off on a different tangent, but the reality of Islamophobia is undeniable. And yet somehow the BJP have manufactured Hindu phobia, which is non-existent anywhere. And yet people are starting to talk about it. So I think the BJP are clever enough to win Punjab. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Mr. Muzammil. So the next question is for Mr. Muzammil and Dr. Farhanaz. The question is, would Indian polity from the left be able to reverse the ongoing onslaught from the Hindutva political parties? If no, keeping India's economic expediency for the international community aside, what measures could be taken by domestic Indian and international actors to ensure protection of fundamental rights of plural communities in India, such as Muslims, Christians, and Dalits? So if Mr. Muzammil, you could go first.
I would strongly suggest, as Dr. Farhanaz is the only female on the platform, that she be given priority over me.
We can come to Mr. Muzammil later. Dr. Farhanaz, if you could please give your views on it first.
Thank you, Muzammil. Yeah, so I would say that if you look at the other minorities and communities who are living there in India, they have all the rights, equal rights as other Hindus are having in India. So the followers of all other religion in India also have their proper place in India per the proponent of the ideology of India in the past that Gandhi and all those prominent leaders projected and promoted at that time. But recently, according to Hindutva, whatever is happening in India, it is leading to a serious fissures in the entire system of Indian democracy and everything. So if they will really go back, I would say it's not only India where RSS, BJP influence and their infiltration is too strong, and Hindu phobia that Muzammil was referring to is too strong, not only within India, but across the world as well. And they have strong infiltration into the Western countries and their system, their education system as well. So if they have access to all those top-notch universities, let's call it Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, and you just name it, if they can bring certain changes in those societies and their diaspora is playing their active role, do you think that they can let the people living in the Indian borders do something against them? It's really questionable, and I really doubt it. Unless RSS themselves realize the fact that if they continue with this extremist and fundamentalist and narcissist ideology, it is leading towards division within India. Unless and until RSS realize the fact, nothing can stop them from pursuing their extremist ideology in India. Over to you, Muzammil.
Thank you, Dr. Farah. I think Waqas might also be able to help me out here, but wasn't it just, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, that a report was published whereby Rahul Gandhi's tweets were shadow banned within India. This has nothing to do with Twitter. This has everything to do with the BJP. I've been issued multiple warnings by Twitter that the Jammu Kashmir police, the Indian government, have blocked me inside India. So when we talk about what the people can do, when the information doesn't exist and the information is not being allowed to be disseminated within the common population in India, then what hopes are there of them being aware and alert of what is happening around them? Now, there are certain changes. There is a particular class of people. We've seen people like Sharjeel Imam, Sharjeel Usmani, what's his name? Umar Khalid. Now, these people are the woke class. I think that's the term that the modern generation called the woke class. Now, these are people that are more connected to the internet, more connected to books, more connected to the international world. They read more, they study more. They're Marxists, they're leftists, they're communists. So they are, excuse my language, they're natural communists. So they oppose the BJP. But again, I'm going to say something that's a little bit controversial. Just because you're against the BJP does not mean that you want a pluralist Indian society. Sorry, Dr. Farah, you wanted to intervene.
Yeah, I just want to add on something to it. As you mentioned about blocking your Twitter account and things like that, I think that is the only the way the BJP can control different voices. So when they introduced the citizenship law and the discriminatory citizens things were coming up on various Twitter accounts, around 20,000 or 1,200 Twitter accounts were asked to be blocked by Twitter. This is what they usually do. And what can you expect from the leadership of BJP, where Prime Minister Modi called all the farmers protesters as parasites, and where Amit Shah called the illegal immigrants as termites? So what can you expect from them, that they will be doing something for the other minorities living there and demanding their rights, where it happens to be that BJP is not only the ruling party, but a very powerful party, a very fundamentalist, powerful party. Yeah, to you.
If I can controversially add that what the people can do, the question was basically what can the people do to change the circumstances? I think that if they're not willing to look beyond the rhetoric that the BJP is feeding, force feeding them down their necks, down their throats, if they're not willing to look beyond that, then there's nothing that they can do. You only need to look at the condition of the Muslims over the last 75 years inside India. They tolerated, they were forced to be more patriotic than Hindus, they were forced to be more nationalistic than Hindus, and it didn't serve them very well. The CAA and NRC bills still were passed, which are basically anti-Muslim and anti-minorities. So until a revolution happens, until the people wake up and rebel against a fascist state, I mean, it's not just autocratic, it's not just, this is totalitarian, whatever the word is. It's very early in the morning for me. It's extremely brutal. I mean, I'm not even talking about Kashmir. If I go to Kashmir and explain what's happened in Kashmir over 70 years, irrespective of the parties, when we talk about that, how the minorities and how the people inside India can make the situation better for themselves, I go back to what my essential point was. Be it Congress or be it the BJP, the people of Kashmir still suffer the same fate. Their ideology is still the same. The deep state of India still wants the same thing. They want that Akhand Bharat. They will do anything to get it done. They don't care if they have to trample over their own Hindu minorities. They are Hindus nonetheless, still Hindus. They still identify as Hindus. They don't care. It doesn't matter to them because they want a particular type of Hinduism. They want a particular type of Indian. So unfortunately, I think until there is a rebellion and until the international community sees that India is a fascist state, they recognize that this is replicating Mussolini and Hitler and all the other fascists in history, there is not going to be a change within India.
Yeah, if I can just here.
Sure. Yes, Dr. Farah, please.
Thank you. So as Zamil was mentioning, that unless and until the people themselves, they want to bring a change, nothing is going to happen. So I think people are already frustrated with these extreme, every society can get frustrated with such kind of extreme measures that any political system who introduces that. Like I was reading some of the comments made by the Indian researchers where they were mentioning that they are not allowed to do research openly. So what kind of academics they are in India? I'm not talking about those Indian diaspora who live overseas. So that is one of the issues that people are raising, and they have started talking about it at the cost of their life, right? This is very serious. They started speaking up at the cost of their life. So unless and until these moderate sort of people who think that what is good and what is bad for the larger society, I think nothing can happen for the betterment of not only the Hindus that I was projecting in my part of speech. The issue is not only minorities, the issue is Hindus' rights as well. Because how can you project 10% understanding on the entire 90% of the entire population, which includes Hindus as well? That is really, really serious, alarming. And according to the Human Rights and the Human Rights Watch, all their reports and figures suggest that India is really in violation of the basic rights of human beings there. if it is minorities or if it is Hindus. So they are aware of it. And I think the international community, along with the help and support of the Hindus and the minorities who are living in India, they have to project their concerns, and then the international community can take account of that. Until that, nothing is going to, to bring forward any sort of solutions for the existing problems that is happening due to the BJP and the RSS agenda in India.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farah and Muzammil. If I could just bring in Vikas into the conversation. So Vikas, Mr. Muzammil, he basically referred to and quoted how the Indian government, the BJP government, is able to manipulate and exploit digital spaces to kind of perpetuate the narrative and to kind of suppress dissenting voices. So if you could please just, since that's your area of research and that's what you focus on, if you could basically talk about the ways and the means that the Indian government uses to get away with it, and what can be done on the digital spaces by other actors to kind of fight back against the Hindutva narrative on digital spaces and social media, etc.
Yes, thank you for your question. I think, like Muzammil mentioned, the recent case of Rahul Gandhi being shadow banned, I think that's always happening in terms of who's getting banned and who's not. I think the most potent example of that is when Sambit Batra's tweet was labeled as manipulated media. And there was this huge hue and cry, and there was a raid on Twitter's offices as well. And Twitter was served notices and filed for their National Regulation Act. I forget the name of the law. But basically, that was made for Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to comply with India's laws and to ensure that none of the posts that they have there are not based on. I forgot the criteria, but it was very vague, and it was actually just there to stamp out dissent. This happened right after the farmers' protests, and of course, right when there was this whole discourse on dossiers. You had these toolkits. You had these toolkits by Greta, then you had a toolkit by an Indian activist who wanted to basically to present a platform and present a way to show how social media users could dissent online. But see, the case with India and how they have, Ajit Doval got mentioned as well, the way they have basically lobbied for this, not just in India, but outside of India as well. I think the Hindu American Foundation is a very good example of it recently, and how they've raised this issue where the Cal State University, I think, started this, that released a policy stating that they wouldn't allow students to be discriminated on the basis of caste. And the Hindu American Foundation challenged that and said that that's singling out and discriminating against just Hindus. So, and again, if you see who gets funding for the Hindu American Foundation, how the kind of fundraisers they have in DC, and the extent of their efforts to just lobby for these things in the US Senate and the House, it's very frightening. And it's quite startling to see just to what extent their reach is and to where they can go. Twitter is a perfect example. Facebook has been served multiple notices. So, and this information is very much a part of the Indian playbook. The way we have seen it, I think we released a study a few months back mapping out how this activity has been mapped, especially in relation to the LAC crisis, the LAC standoff with China, and also the surgical strikes, so-called surgical strikes against Pakistan. And what we've noticed is just there's overwhelming evidence of not just platform manipulation, of not just fake news, but of a willful, deliberate campaign to push certain narratives and propaganda across all platforms. And there are platforms that a lot of which get stuck, which a lot of them fly under the radar as well. There's Discord, there's Telegram, and it's quite startling to see how active and how extensive their reach and their focus is just on pushing their narrative, on maligning Pakistan and China, and on ensuring that India's desires to project itself as a regional hegemon get pushed. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikas. So I have one very short comment, which is related to the BJP Twitter connection that was being discussed by Vikas as well as Muzammil. And then I have a question for Dr. Farah Naz. So the comment and the question is by Mr. Munib Salman. He's a researcher at IPRI, and he says that to add to the BJP Twitter connection, Twitter CEO donated a huge sum of CSR fund to an RSS affiliated charity during his visit to India, when he also met PM Modi. So I think it kind of adds to what Muzammil and Vikas were talking about. And Dr. Farah, the question to you is that what have been the motives behind public support for BJP's Hindutva agenda? Because as compared to 2014 elections, BJP's seat count increased in 2019. And there must have been some underlying reasons for increasing BJP support in contrast to other parties in India. Is it because the BJP is able to kind of deliver on other things that it kind of campaigns around? If you could please elaborate on that.
Who's going first?
Dr. Farah, if you could please give your point of view.
Okay. So for BJP, if we look at the way they manage their political system, they're very strong in media manipulation, media projection, media control, and not only Indian media, but international media as well. If we look at the YouTube, Twitter, and all social media platforms, in the BJP influence is quite stronger. So one cannot deny their manipulation system in the digitalized world these days. And what could be the reasons that they are winning more seats as compared to their performance? If their performance is too poor, then probably they should not be winning more seats. So that could be they do satisfy the larger population in India in terms of their policies, which is quite anti-Pakistan, anti-Kashmir. So, and they made some promises before getting into power that once they get into power, they will make Kashmir a part of India permanently. And with the Article 370, they took certain steps, and that led towards showcasing that, yes, whatever they promised, they are really fulfilling and standing on those promises. So it does satisfy some of the Indian pockets in the Indian society, which think that whatever they promise, they are really delivering on those fronts, but they are not realizing the consequences of all those revocations and amendments into the constitutional arrangements of India, that with the revocation of Article 370, what sort of implication it will bring on all other minorities, and will they be able to sustain those amendments in the future? So probably it's too early to say whether BJP will be able to make it in the future election as well or not, because now people are probably realizing the larger influence of BJP in the Indian in damaging the Indian society altogether. But overall, I think it's the BJP manipulation through media, the way they showcase that these are something bright that they're doing for the Indian society at large. But I think they are really ruining whatever India should be. They're really going in another direction.
Thank you, Dr. Farah. So we're going to move to our last question, which is for Mr. Muzammil Ayub Thakur. Mr. Muzammil, if you could please elaborate, since you're located in the United Kingdom, so if you could please elaborate on the role of Kashmiri diaspora to mobilize the diaspora in the UK or globally in in support of the Kashmir movement. You have been consistently conducting Twitter spaces as well on the various facets of Kashmir in the wake of the suppression of the press and media in the Kashmir region. So if you could kindly just talk about that. Thank you.
It's interesting that you mention the Twitter spaces that we have been holding. It's based on that me and Dr. Asif Dar, we were charged under the UAPA law, which means that essentially that if we go back to Kashmir, we go to jail for 7 years. That's pretty much the condition of the diaspora. If we speak up, then we risk our families, we risk our own lives. I've already lost 2 of my cousins. Another cousin was tortured on a loudspeaker in a masjid, so that the fear could be instilled among the local population. Dr. Asif Dar's parents, elderly parents, are routinely harassed multiple times a day. Home is raided repeatedly. and family members arrested. And this is just 2 people that are living outside of Kashmir. If you can only imagine the condition of the diaspora post 2019, post the BJP's emergence in India, of the kind of clampdown that has happened in advocacy for the Kashmir cause. The Indian, not just in the United Kingdom, but the Indian High Commission, the embassies, are routinely monitoring not just Kashmir, but of course Khalistani movements as well. And I think that in Germany, 2 people were arrested for spying against other Indians, 2 or 3 people in Germany. So the diaspora works in different ways. We have the Azad Kashmiri diaspora, who of course are safe and secure, and they do a phenomenal amount of work, especially at grassroots level, of educating people and protesting. For the Indian occupied Kashmiri diaspora, a lot of the work has to be done behind the scenes. Not everybody can afford to be seen in public, risk for themselves as well as for their families. There are a very, very limited number of people that are willing to or able to put their faces out there and risk their lives and of course their families' lives, but that does not take away from the tremendous amount of work that is happening behind the scenes. I'll give you a simple example of the case of Zia Mustafa. Zia Mustafa, that was a 15-year-old Zia Mustafa that crossed over in 2003, that was killed in a staged fake encounter in Kashmir just a few months ago, whose case has now been taken up by Legal Forum for Kashmir in Islamabad, who have then forwarded it to Stoke white solicitors in the United Kingdom to do work. This is the kind of lawfare that is being done. So the Kashmiri diaspora is active. It's just that we try to preserve our identities. We try to restrain ourselves from publicity simply for the reason, for the protection of our own families. However, there are many people, many people that are still working behind the scenes diligently and emphatically to make sure that the Indian agenda is curtailed and subdued. I do also want to mention that all work is not public related. There is so much work being done in terms of documentation. I think Umar Farooq Saab, you mentioned that you have researchers. It is so important to have researchers, so important to have professors, so important to have academics, so important to have lawyers, doctors, so that everybody can write something, research in regards to Kashmir, what is happening inside Kashmir, and then submit those documentations to various institutions, be they human rights or political or whatever. So there are plenty of Kashmiris in the diaspora that are doing work that is grassroots in terms of activism and protesting, but there is also another group that are diligently working in terms of documentation, exposing the crimes. You may not see their real names, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist.
Of course. Thank you so much, Mr. Muzammil. With that, we'll conclude with the Q&A session. I would now request Acting President IPRI, Brigadier Rashid Wali Janjua, to present his concluding remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Umar. I think a very, very absorbing and very educative discourse. And like always, Muzammil Saab was at his most erudite best, and he does it with a lot of passion. So becoming of a Kashmiri speaks from the heart. And Dr. Raja Kaisar, as usual, you bring a very solid academic perspective to the whole discourse. And Dr. Farhanaz, I'm really grateful. You pointed out some real important facts, and like always, you're so structured in your discourse. So I thank you all. And I leave a message that important aspects like epistemic violence need to be dealt on several planes. Only digital space answering might not do the trick, as we know that they are using all kinds of blandishments. BJP, RSS, they are using that famous tech fog app, for instance, which manipulates the whole, mobs and feeds them falsehoods. And that tech fog app was called out by independent observers, and that has been noticed by international community as well. But those are the things that we need to contend with. And we also know that this would require an awakening within the Indian masses themselves, so as to present a united opposition front, because NGOs or the digital space advocacy people alone would not be able to nudge a hard-boiled Hindutva driven government like BJP, which has a RSS support. We know how they won the state assemblies in Karnataka, Madhya Pradesh. It was not through their popular appeal. They had almost lost the elections, but they resorted to those electoral manipulations and alliances shifting, and they crowbarred their way through subverting the alliances. The fractured and disunited opposition yielded to them. Same was the case with Meghalaya, Manipur, Goa, and Arunachal Pradesh, where the opposition had it gelled together. It would have beaten BJP, but it was the other way around. But the hope lies in those conscientious objectors who are still sticking their neck out, risking everything that they have for resisting the juggernaut of Hindutva. And we need to support them. And there are international initiatives like Russell Tribunal, which was recently held on 21st December, which pointed out in sharp relief the crimes against humanity that are being committed, and they had a eerie resemblance to what happened to North Vietnamese during the Vietnam conflict. And the world community slowly is about, it's beginning to take notice of those things. And it is these attempts which are based upon some legal lawfare instrument, as well as those credible international forums that would ultimately give traction to this whole effort of calling out this clear and present danger to regional as well as internal peace in South Asia. So I thank all the participants for a very absorbing discourse, and we look forward to having you around in our subsequent sessions as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. With that, we end today's webinar. I thank all the worthy speakers for taking out the time from their busy schedules to join us. And I thank all the participants, the audiences that joined us virtually. For you to stay updated with our research activities, please follow IPRI on our official social media pages. Thank you. Take care. Goodbye.